Okay, let's keep things short for the beginning, and we can already start going into the details. And I'm gonna be the first speaker today, and I'll be presenting to you a library that I mostly developed, and this is a contexted library. So let's start. I'll share the screen because today presentation will be mostly showing you the code around. So just a moment. Okay, you should see already the VS Code shared view. So yeah, all right, great. Is the font the right size for you, or would you like me to make it a little bit bigger? Much bigger. Okay. So hopefully I'll be able to, maybe let's start with this one. Okay. So the context. The context of creating the contexted library. So I'm not sure how long are you with Elixir and Phoenix, but I still remember the times where there was something called Phoenix model inside of Phoenix. And I believe this concept was borrowed from Ruby on Rails because, as you know, probably Jose is coming from Ruby background. I'm not sure about Chris, but I guess he's from this background too. And in Rails, you would have something called model, where everything would happen when it comes to a business logic would happen around resources. So if you have user, all of the interactions with SQL would be put inside of the class called user. So there was no concept related to context then there. And with one of the versions of Phoenix, Phoenix introduced something called context. And I strongly believed it didn't really influence the, let's say, the guidelines when it comes to the strict guidelines that you have to follow in your Phoenix projects, but rather it showed you a concept that you can follow because it's optional, that would lead you to a good programming patterns. So I recently wrote a blog post about context maintainability. I would like to share it with you here alongside with some other links, just to make sure that if you'd like to check more about what I'm talking about today, then you can read about it after the meetup. And in Phoenix, you're now you should now follow the Phoenix context concept instead of this Phoenix model. Now, what Phoenix context is basically organizing your code in a context that group resources that have a common functionality or common business perspective. So you can imagine that you have an app where you have a blog, where you have payments, where you have subscription. And these three modules that I just said are a different context within the application. So you're not organizing your code around the resources, specific resources. You're organizing your code around the context. And there is a generator that you can use in Phoenix to create a context and a resource within a given context. For instance, the one that I just pasted on the chat will create a post resource within a blog context, and it's gonna create it under the posts table with a field called content of type string. Now, the thing that you see here is a blog context within the application. I created this project for the article that I wrote about context maintainability, just to make sure that you can easily follow what I mean. So alongside with the line that I just pasted on the chat, I also created a comment and post image resources within the blog context. As you can see, it's just a very simple resource that I'm generating here to illustrate something. Now, all of these resources have been created under the blog context. Phoenix generator, by default, appends a lot of crude functions that you can use out of the box for these resources. And Phoenix generator will put every of these functions in one module. Now, the problem that appears here is that, as you can see, of course, a majority of these lines that you can see in this module are comments. But in the real case scenario, you would have much more functions defined in here. But with these comments and the default generator, you already have almost 300 lines in this module. So you can see that these modules are growing, and they are growing very fast. It's not that you'll end up with 300 lines, you'll end up with, I don't know, maybe even 3,000 lines. So this is the first problem I can see here that I try to tackle with this library. The other problem I can see here is that this is just the concept that you can follow, but nothing stops you from putting a function here that will call another context. So for instance, I also have an account context here, and there is a list users function. And nothing stops me to call an account list users function here, of course, considering that I already have the alias defined, because Phoenix doesn't enforce you to not create such references. This is a cross reference between two different contexts, and it creates a lot of mess in the code. First of all, because in the end, you're not very sure where should you put a functions that touches two different contexts. Should it be in the blog context, or should it be in the account context? It's not very clear. And then one developer will put it into blog context, one will put it in the account. So no one is really sure where should you search for a given functionality. Then, of course, it creates some references between two contexts that will have an impact on the compilation time. And just as a general rule, not only here, but also especially in the objective programming, you should create as less references between two different conceptual resources within the app as possible. So what I try to tackle with this contexted library is that we don't want the context modules to be very big, like this one. And also, I wanted to make sure that no one is referencing another context from another context. So it won't happen that someone will be able to call account list users within the blog context. At the beginning, it was just a test to check if it's even possible to do it, but it turned out that it is. And I can show you now the concept that we are using at Curiosum to not end up with these big context modules. And then from this, I will move on to the contexted library version that we now promote inside of our company. So I'm now on the branch where I can show you how we would write a block context at Curiosum to maintain it well. So now the block context defines a delegated functions to, as you can see, modules that are a plural version of the resource names. So we have blog posts, blog comments, blog post images. We call it internally a subcontext. a subcontext would be a module that defines functions that are related to a given resource. So the posts subcontext will define functions for the post resource. The comments subcontext will define functions for the comment resource, and so on. And now the block context will group all of these functions using the dev delegates to create an API for the outside world. And by outside world, I mean the places where you would like to interact with the context, with the business logic. For instance, controllers. Yeah, that would be the most common pattern. And eventually, in the application, everywhere where you would like to interact with context, you will interact with the context, not with subcontext. Just to give you an idea of how the posts subcontext may look like, I just basically took all of these functions that related to post inside of the old block context module generated by the Finis generator and pasted it here. And then we would have to define all of the delegates inside of block. Just a moment. This solution solves the problem of big context files. However, it doesn't still control whether you call another subcontext from your context. So you can still call account context function from the block. There is also a lot of writing associated with this solution because you always have to create these dev delegates, and this file is just 30 lines long, but usually it can be much bigger. And it's a bit annoying that you have to basically define all of these dev delegates that already somewhere. There is also yet another problem here. You cannot use specs and docs in these functions. So basically, the dev delegate doesn't automatically append a doc and a spec of the function that it delegates to. Okay, so you will not see a doc from this post and a spec from this post if you call it from block context. It's a bit annoying because you cannot use the documentation in the code. So if you type a block dot and you like to code list post, it won't show you a documentation for this function because it basically doesn't work. It just delegates. It's just a function that calls another function. So these type of problems we encountered while we were following this solution. And now I can show you how the contexted version of these contexts look like. So first of all, let's maybe go to the config of this library. You can see two options here that you have to set up, but I'll start with this one, context. So in order this to work fine, to control whether a block context will call a function from account context, you have to first define the contexts that are within your application in this place. So of course, if you add another context to your application, you'll have to add this context to this list. It won't automatically detect where are your context modules, because basically a context module doesn't have anything special inside of it that would tell that this is exactly the context module. So we specified those here, and I'm also going to improve this library so that you'll be able to basically define different subsets here. I think it might be useful for the umbrella apps and maybe for some monolith apps as well. So once you have these defined, then you cannot call the function from, let's say, block within an account context. And to illustrate this for you, I will just start with the showcase of how it works. So don't look at the delegate all yet, because I'm gonna explain it to you very soon. But I think in users, let me just search through it. I defined somewhere. Oh yeah, here. So let's say that in the post subcontext module, I define a function, like a very sample function that is called wrong context, that will call the list users function from the account. We are in the block, so this one should not work. The goal of this functionality will be to raise an error if such a cross-referencing is happening. So I'll first remove the build, and let's try to compile this project. It will just take a moment. Not sure now if I saved it. I hope I did. We'll see. Yeah. So as you can see, we have an error. And this error is saying that you can't reference, and this long name of the app, account context within block context. And this basically works as long as you define the list of contexts that you have in the app. So with this library, you can forget about cross-referencing, but because it will not compile the project. Therefore, developers will not be able to somehow skip this. So this is the first thing. The second thing is automating the delegation. So we've been using this concept a lot in Curiosum, and we realized that there's a lot of additional writing in regards to the delegations. So I created a function here that you first have to import the delegator module from the contexted library here, and then you can use a delegate all function and pass the module as an argument. It will take all of the public functions defined in this module and will create automatically the delegations for all of these functions defined within users. I may want to also expand this to be able to pass on a list of modules here, so that maybe you can just call delegate all once. So basically, it automates a lot of writing for you. But also, I was able to research the topic of automation of creating the specs as well as the docs for the functions that are being generated here as delegates. And in order this to work, you have the other option here, enable recompilation. It turns out that Elixir will basically, not Elixir, will compile the whole project in an order that makes sense for him. You cannot enforce, unless I couldn't find it. If you know the solution, then let me know. You cannot force Mix to compile the module after a certain list of modules are compiled. In order to generate the specs as well as the docs, you have to have the function and the module compiled first, and only then you can take these specs and doc metadata to generate automatically the specs and docs metadata for the delegated functions. So what enable recompilation does is that it basically after the whole project is compiled, it takes the list of contexts that we defined in here, checks where the Beam files are located in the project, removes these files, and recompile those again. So it won't recompile the whole project. It will only recompile the context modules. At this point, the subcontexts are generated. They are available as a Beam files. So you can now use those to create a docs and specs automatically. How it works, I can show you right now. I'll have to first comment this out because we want to make sure that it won't fail during the compilation time here. And once it's compiled, I will get into the console to show you that you can see the documentation for a given function. So yeah, for instance, we have this function called int to string. We have a very basic documentation here as well as its spec. Let's use the h function in IEX with the functionality to check what's inside here. So first of all, the specs are exactly like defined in here. It was generated with the delegate all function automatically. There is also an information that this function is actually delegating to something. And we have also a doc here. So everything we needed to be able to access the documentation specs during the development. You can think of putting this option into dev environment, for instance, but this option is optional. If you don't want to use it and you don't care, you don't have to enable it. It used not to be optional, but I realized this today and pushed a new release version for that. It's now optional. So unless you specify that you would like to enable recompilation, it will not recompile the project. Okay, and last thing, let's say that I was considering if I should or not put this part into this library, but I realized that there's also one more thing that we can do to speed up the process of generating the context. There are a bunch of contexts that basically do the CRUD operations. So the things that we saw that the Phoenix generated created. And I thought that it may also speed up the creating of context files in our projects. So I've added one more module into context library. It's called CRUD, where you only have to pass on two required options. First one is repo that we're gonna use to fetch and interact with data, and the schema that we'll use to, again, interact with data, but with specific resource. And there is also one additional option that you can use to exclude some of the functions that are being generated. If you don't want to generate all of them, and you can see in the documentation on GitHub as well as the Hex docs, which functions are generated, you can skip those and generate only the ones that you'd like to generate. So this is like a additional thing that you can use. Maybe your context will not use a repo at all, so you don't have to, but it's optional. And the most important ones are the delegations and being able to control if you do a cross-referencing between contexts. And I think that's it. Maybe one more thing, one more yeah, curiosity about the contexted library, how to actually do these kind of things, how to be able to detect that there is a module that references the other module. There is something called tracer in Elixir, where you implement specific trace functions, and when Mix will compile the project, it will call these callback trace functions whenever a certain event is happening. For instance, there is an alias declaration or something like this. So you can listen to this kind of operations that Mix is doing during the compilation and do something with it. So I'm basically waiting here for information from the tracer that there is a module that calls another module. And it appears that these modules are defined in the context option within the contexted config. So if you're interested in how it works, how I build this library, of course, feel invited to check this out on GitHub. And if you have follow-up questions, you can reach out to me. And of course, if you would include this library into your project and find any errors, I encourage you to create an issue so that we can fix it as soon as possible. And I think that's it for now. If you're very interested in this topic, in the links that I pasted on the chat, you can read the whole context maintainability guidelines I wrote about on our blog, as well as you can check the first meetup edition we had, where I was explaining this concept of structuring the Elixir Phoenix project around the context. This is a recording from YouTube. And there is also a link to contexted repository where you can check this out. Okay, so now I'll close this this view and move on to Q&A. So if you have any questions for me, yeah, feel free to write them on the chat. We'll wait a minute. I can see that someone is typing, so I guess there will be a question. And I also forgot that since it's open source, you can also contribute on your own. So if you'd like to help us develop this library, then of course, feel free. I know someone is typing, but let's still wait a minute just to make sure. In the meantime, I will say that we have right now 3 open source libraries that we have on our Curiosum dev account on GitHub. One of these is of course contexted. The other one is Kanta, which is a translation manager that you can seamlessly integrate with the get text in your project, and the last one is Permit, which allows you to authorize which enables you to authorize some resources in the Elixir projects. So we have a first question. What is the folder structure used to organize this subcontext? If I would close this, I'm not sure if the Q&A, it might corrupt some Q&A questions, but in general, what I do is I structure the lib folder around the context, and you can, for instance, have a account folder, blog folder, and then within these folders, I basically put either subcontext or context folder. You can name it as you want. There's no such a thing in Phoenix documentation as subcontext. It's just naming that we invented to be able to talk about it. So you can call it, for instance, subcontext. And I also forgot about telling you that it may happen that within one context, you need to write a function that will need both, for instance, post and comment from blog context. What to do? Should you put it into posts or comments subcontext? And then I believe there should be one more subcontext called shared. In shared, you put any function that needs to interact with more than one resource defined in the same context. So that's the goal here. Also, in the context maintainability blog post, I wrote about services. This is the case where you need to call functions from more than one context. So if you're interested in reading more about it, I would direct you to the blog post because yeah, this is yet another concept that you can use. Okay, I hope this answered the question. Another question: how does yeah, thank you for thank you. How does having a purely delegating context module improve code quality or coding experience? And probably linked to this, when you disallow using context functions from within other contexts, the cross-referencing feature is awesome. But how do you use the context from controllers? So you basically, maybe I'll start with the second question. You basically call the function from the context in the controller. So if you would like to fetch users from account, you basically call account.listUsers and assign them to users. So I'm not sure if I understand this question right, because just like you would use the context normally, you also call a function from the context here. Just a moment. Maybe I'll be able to show you this one after the Q&A. And the first question was, how does having a purely delegating context module improve code quality or the coding experience? It's not mainly about the coding experience, or yeah, it's not mainly about coding experience, but to some extent, maybe it does improve the coding experience because you have a clear understanding that if you write a function that relates to some resource, you know that you have to put it into given context and given file. So you put some rules on where to put the functions so that every developer, if he or she follows this rule, will put the code into the right place so that the coding experience is, let's say, it makes it easier to write the code because you don't ask yourself, where should I put this function? That's the first thing. And when it comes to code quality, as I said, the more resources you put into context, the bigger the context becomes. So the code quality is all about reducing the amount of lines that you write within a context file, because then you basically split this big context into smaller ones. It's easier to test things because you then you don't have to write one big test file. You can write a test file per subcontext, for instance. And the moment you create a context that has like 600 lines of code, you already start to realize that it's very hard to follow. There's a chaos because nothing is grouped usually. The developers put the functions where they want. So for instance, they won't group the users related functions into one block, but they will just put them randomly in some places. And it's just too big to control it. So let's say that it improved code quality because of that.